Okay, in terms of the stuff, as always, just bad news. Some negative news, but not today. In terms of deadline, the same as been all along. No changes there. Quizzes part 1, deadline 5 back May 19th. Exam 1, quizzes part 2, deadline 5 May 28th. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, deadline June 9th. Exam 3, deadline 5 is June 17th. And exam 4, quizzes part 4, exam 5, deadline 5, June 18th. Then for the paper, the draft deadline, if you want to do one, deadline 5 is June 10th. You can do as many drafts as you'd like until either you get the grade you want, or you get tired of the process, or time comes to an end. For the +5 bonus, it's June 11th. Full credit deadline June 15th, and half June 18th. And then the grades go in on June 19th, and then that's that. Before pressing on for new stuff, any stuff about the old stuff, or the stuff to be, or any other stuff that needs more stuff. Oh, the drafts?
Yeah.
Oh, the way the drafts work is the drafts themselves, just as a draft, neither counts against you or for you, doesn't go through Blackboard. You just turn it to me, I mark it up and get it back to you. I do record the grade you get on each draft, but then to get the get the +5 bonus, the pro credit, or whichever option you want, you upload your final version of the paper there. So there's on Blackboard, there's no draft category. You turn the draft into me, print it up, I put a hypothetical grade on it, get it back to you, and then when you have the final version, when you want to end the paper, the process, you upload it to whatever the appropriate deadline is. So like if you get your draft done, get it back, decide this grade's fine, thing to do is just upload it to Blackboard by that deadline. Yeah, and so if you just do a draft and never upload anything to Blackboard, then I'll check to see if you did a draft, but if you never upload anything to Blackboard, you might not get a grade on that. Because in order for me to run through the plagiarism checker, etc., goes through Blackboard. Does that clarify stuff? Okay, so the drafts, if you want to do a draft, print it, bring it to me, I put a hypothetical grade on it, get it back to you. Then I don't put a grade in Blackboard for that, because it's just your final version. To get the grade on the final version, when you're complete with the paper and satisfied, or just sick of the process, upload it to whichever is available. So if it's before by June 11th, the +5 bonus. If it's June 15th, after June 11th, it goes in for full credit. And then if it's in after the 15th, but before the 18th or the 19th, it goes in for half. So be sure to upload your final version to Blackboard, because that's what I'll grade and put in the grading form. Okay, anything else? Okay, so last time we're looking at our good dead friend David Hume. Scottish, did some stuff, died in 1776, and of course is still dead today. And his view of religion is essentially skeptical. He takes the view that we cannot give decisive arguments for the existence of God, but on the other side of the coin, that lack of decisive means we can't give decisive arguments against God's existence. So the view is essentially skepticism. You can't know either way. Now we looked at last time his argument about causation, and now we turn to his rejection of the design argument. As you recall in the ancient days last week, the argument from design generically works like this. You look around the universe, stuff seems designed. One common example of this would be looking at things like, well, us, and seeing that we seem to be pretty well, very well suited our environment. Other examples people often use are things like, well, you take fish. They're in water, they got gills. They seem well designed for water. You have birds, they got wings and feathers, and they seem well designed for the air. At least birds that hang out in the air, as opposed to like penguins and kiwis that mostly hang on the ground or in water. Now, that argument by design, again, pretty standard argument. There seems to be a design of things in the universe, no design without a designer, this designer is God, God exists. Interestingly, abhorrently enough, Hume's response to that is sort of a precursor to our good dead friend Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, He is the guy that, wrote The Origin of Species and is credited with developing the theory of evolution. Interestingly, boringly enough, the idea of natural selection goes way back before Socrates. There was a pre-Socratic philosopher who said animals, things are just put together randomly, and the ones that don't work out just die. They just don't make it. And he gave kind of the ridiculous example. Imagine like a cow that just had like, twigs for legs, literally like sticks. Well, that cow's not going to make it, so you won't see any of those. Now Hume brings forth a similar sort of argument. He claims that if you look at the universe, it looks more like not like a machine that's been built and designed, but more like a plant or animal that, to use modern terms, has evolved. And he explicitly addresses the argument, about how things seem to ideally match their environment. I mean, we breathe air, we seem to be very well suited for this, so we might infer we're designed for it, we're built for it. And Hume's answer is the one that was given before Socrates. If animals did not match their environment, they would just die. So imagine if you took, it'd be like an aquatic creature, you stuck like a moose, like in a lake. The moose is not going to make it. Things that are able to survive seem to be ideally suited because the environment did not kill them. So that's what he's giving what we now recognize as the argument from natural selection. What appears to be design is just the environment killing things that just can't make it. Now again, this is still a point of considerable, debate today, at least, at a popular level. We have the view of natural selection. How do you explain that things seem to fit? Well, if they didn't fit, they'd be dead, so they wouldn't be here, so you wouldn't see them. And then there's the alternative view that they were designed. But Hume comes down on what we now would call natural selection. We now turn to his addressing another classic argument. One argument we didn't look at, the particular version of this, comes from our good dead friend David Hume. And it goes like this. There's a philosophical principle that you can infer the cause of something by examining the effect. And that's, in many ways, a reasonable principle. For example, it's the way we, in fact, do reason. We see the effect of something, and we try to backtrack to the likely or possible cause. Now, in the case of God, the argument usually goes like this. We have an effect, like the universe, and then we infer the existence of God from that. Now, Hume's issue is this. He's taking issue with the inference of there being a perfect, infinite God inferred from the universe we got. So he's not rejecting the idea that you can get inferences about what we call effects from cause, although as we saw last time, his definition of cause is somewhat unusual. But his argument is going to be that from what we observe, the effect, the universe, we cannot infer an infinite, perfect God. And he gives 5 reasons why. Reason 1. Suppose we do make the assumption that the cause has got to be at least great as the effect, that you can't get something from nothing, which seems like in many ways, like a safe assumption. In many ways, you can look at the way kind of physics and our notions of like conservation of energy works. To use my usual crappy analogy, if you get a smartphone and it's charged up to a certain level, whatever charged it had to have at least that much charge. You can't get more, more charge than you get. If you could, I guess that'd be kind of handy, but unfortunately it doesn't work that way. Now, but Hume says this. If we look at the universe, he says we can't infer an infinite cause from a finite effect. So he is assuming the universe is finite, which is still an important question in cosmology and astrophysics today, namely how big the universe is. We know it's pretty big, but one question that goes back to the ancient Greeks is, does the universe have boundaries? Is it finite? Now, the only way to really tell would be to go and kind of like look or travel there, and if you end up like running into a boundary like in a fishbowl, you'd say, well, I guess it's finite. But if you just keep on going and going, you really couldn't be sure, because as long as you're going, maybe it's just up ahead, or maybe there is no boundary. And so there is still the interesting or perhaps boring question, do we live in a finite universe like a fishbowl, or is it infinite? And what would that even mean? And if there is a finite universe, what's outside of it, if anything? Now, so if we assume a finite universe, then according to Hume, we couldn't infer an infinite cause from it. But if we get an infinite universe, maybe we could infer an infinite cause. Second problem. God's supposed to be perfect. Now, the problem he brings up here is this. If you look at the universe, is it perfect? Is everything like, when you wake up every day, is it like the song from the Lego movie? Instead of everything being awesome, everything is perfect. Is everything perfect in the universe? No, I mean, one good example is the AC, not working properly. Clearly not perfect. So that example shows, at the very least, not a perfect universe. So his reasoning is, since the universe falls short of perfection, we can't infer a perfect being. Now, to illustrate this further, I'll use my usual crappy analogy. Suppose you go and take a class, and someone comes in, they sit beside you, and they're all like hyperactive and stuff, and they say, hey, this is your lucky day. You're sitting beside the perfect student. Dun, dun, dun. Be sure to friend me on Facebook. Here's my Instagram account. It's, and my Twitter hashtag, my Twitter tag is, perfect student. Now, the person claims to be a perfect student. What would you expect to see at every one of their tests, quizzes, assignments, and papers?
100.
Yeah, 100, but better, perhaps better than 100. Perhaps like 105, an A triple plus. And so, if they get back like the first quiz and it's like a D, or even like a C, and they get back on their test and it's like a C, you probably suspect you're not sitting beside the most perfect student. You suspect if they're just getting C's, you're sitting beside a pretty average student, contrary to their Twitter handle. So his inference is basically the same thing. If you're sitting beside someone who say, hey, I'm a perfect student, and you see they just get C's, you would say, not so perfect. And so what Hume is saying is, if you look at the universe, it doesn't seem to be perfect. So we can't infer a perfect being from an imperfect universe. Again, going with my crap analogy, if you look at someone's grades and all they're getting is C's, you wouldn't infer a perfect student. Or to use another crappy analogy, if you get a meal that's just okay, you wouldn't infer a perfect chef. Or if you get a work done in your car and it's just okay, you would not infer a perfect mechanic. Likewise, if you have a less than perfect universe, Hume says we can't infer a perfect creator. Or so it goes. Third problem it brings up is this. Suppose somebody says, the universe is as good as it possibly can be. So we got to infer a being that's like, really, really awesome. Well, Hume brings up what could be called kind of the learning curve thing. That maybe this isn't the first universe, and what we've got is, lots and lots of practice. So, to use a crappy analogy, if you look at, say, a great artist's work, you wouldn't infer that, say, when they were just starting out, they were that good. And so his point is that maybe if there is a being that created it, maybe he had a lot of practice, so he's gotten better at it. But still, we can't infer a perfect being, or so it goes. Last two problems. Let's take this building, the magnificence that is Tucker Hall. Now, we know it's created by people, but would you infer that one person did all of this? Say Sally or Bob did all the work. No, I figure there's a lot of people are involved in this. And by analogy, if you look at the universe as, we go from the effect, this big universe, he said what we could infer is not just like one God, but a whole bunch of beings involved in its construction. Now, interestingly, boringly enough, that could be consistent with monotheism. Because you could have, just like when you have a building being constructed, you have, typically one person in charge, a lot of people doing the work. And so what a person who is a believer could say is, well, even if we accept that there's multiple beings involved, you could say they were working for the one person in charge, namely God. Lastly, one problem in metaphysics and theology is the ontological kind of problem. What is the nature of God? Now, if we look at a physical universe, what we would infer, according to Hume, is a physical creator, namely God being a physical being. And that, of course, seems to be somewhat problematic. Now, the gist of the 5 ways, again, is not to conclusively disprove God. Hume never says, and thus I've disproven God. His argument, basically, to quickly recap, is this. The argument he's addressing is the idea that you can infer from an effect the cause. And when arguing for God, what people would do is say, well, we've got this universe, so we can infer from it this perfect being. And Hume says, not so fast. That if we look at these 5 problems, we end up with not proof that God conclusively doesn't exist, but we can't infer from an imperfect, finite universe that there is a single perfect being that's non-physical that created everything. And so his argument is essentially the inference is not justified. And again, the kind of best illustration is like with the student. If you have fundamental claims that they're a perfect student, and they only provide C work, you'd say, well, they're not really that perfect. And so the idea is that the universe is not perfect, we can't infer a perfect creator, or so it claims. Now, before heading to Hume's look at the problem of evil, anything about the Hume stuff so far that needs more Hume stuff? Now, Hume lays out a very extensively developed account of the problem of evil that we saw before. And he's got the 3 characters, Philo, Demea, and the Clanthys arguing about this. Now, the character Philo, which represents Hume's view, and the way you tell is whoever wins the dialogue is pretty much certainly the character that represents the view of the author. And he claims, perhaps incorrectly, that everyone accepts that the world is in misery, that everything is awful. So, sort of the first rule of this particular game is he claims you don't have to prove that things are awful. That's established. All we have to do is make people feel it more. Which does raise, a good question. Is that a fair assumption? Because the problem of evil rests on, again, on the assumption or trying to establish that there is evil, that things are bad. And Hume is starting off by saying, everyone accepts it's miserable. If you look at all the authors, for fiction and truth, and you talk to anybody, everyone says, to use a modern bumper sticker, life sucks, then you die, type of deal. But it's a fair question. Are things really as bad as Hume says? Now, even Demea agrees, this is, they go through, a great deal of stuff, but to sort of smush it down, basically the gist of the first part is everything sucks, everyone agrees on this, it's all bad. Everyone from the learned, the poets, and everyday folks. So sort of the first initial establishment or assumption is life is bad. It's all miserable. Now he does note that our good dead friend Leibniz denied this, saying this is the best of all possible worlds. What's his reply to Leibniz? Well, basically here's his reply. He says, his first response is this, that Leibniz was the first person to deny that everything is awful, and since Leibniz was writing so late in history, by our standards, of course, Leibniz is like wicked dead and way back, but from Hume's standpoint, Leibniz is fairly recent. And so Hume says, well, Leibniz is the first person to deny this, and the fact that he's so late in the game proves that he's wrong. Which is, of course, a crappy argument, because if saying stuff like later on made it untrue, that would mean the stuff we're saying today in a way would be wrong, because we're saying it now, making a new discovery. So that first one's a pretty crappy argument. Second one is what can be seen as an appeal to belief. What he says is, Leibniz says this is the best of all possible worlds, and Hume says merely denying this in the face of all the opinion and evidence to the contrary is mistaken. So the gist of it is basically the start and end, that everything is, contrary to the Lego song, everything is not awesome, everything is awful, which is a far less catchy tune, to say the least. Now, to make his point, they lay out all the evils. And I won't go, grind through all these because it's kind of depressing, but here we go. We've got, war, disease, poverty, necessity, weakness. Think of all the bad stuff, thing that gets in the news. I mean, we could take stuff from today's headlines. Recently we had an earthquake in Nepal, which killed a whole bunch of people. Then we had a follow-up earthquake, which killed more people. We had Ebola, ravaging across countries in Africa, killing lots of people. We've got war, ravaging through, well, pretty much everywhere. We've got violence and disease and social unrest and poverty and suffering, and we could go on all day. You could spend all day just clicking through, do a search on Google for like misery, war, suffering, disease, and you just go on until you had to just turn your browser off, or your tears shut off your computer. Now he also lays out, even more problems. If you go to the natural world, everything is killing everything else, or being killed by it. Even, creatures have parasites, even the parasites have parasites, and so everything is horrible and awful. So his point here is establishing, again, everything is not awesome, everything is awful. Which in a way is kind of a, an empirical question. Is it really that awful? Now, to me, it does note that we're perhaps a partial exception. By our skills, we've been able to master the threat of lions, tigers, and bears, and so now we generally don't worry about wild animals. Occasionally it does happen. People get attacked by bears and tigers and possums and squirrels and stuff. But in general, like here, are we generally safe from bears? Do you worry a lot about bears on campus?
Yeah.
Oh, true. They do kind of. They've been wandering in. What about tigers? Do we have a big tiger problem?
No.
Yeah, we got gators though. Get alligators. But they mostly just kind of hang out. Occasionally, only occasionally eating people. So, even if we can handle those, natural enemies, according to Philo, we then create imaginary enemies to, torment us. We make up stuff, To use, the usual examples, they could be things like, supernatural things. We think of like demons and devils and get a little fictional, vampires and werewolves and stuff. But of course, to get less fictional, if we don't have real enemies in our midst, we imagine them. We imagine there are people who are enemies among us, just waiting to do terrible things. And of course, we have to fear death. Now, then of course we have even more problems because, for real, our greatest enemy is us. We may be able to defeat, bears and lions and tigers and bears and so forth, but we're our own worst enemy. As, Kelly, a famous said, he said we have met the enemy and he is us. Which seems true. We've got war, we have exploitation, we have, again, you just got to go on Google and type in something like humans seem to other people, or awful things people do, and you get all the usual stuff. War, theft, murder, economic exploitation, oppression, and so on. So we're pretty bad. And so we end up with all this horrible stuff. Labor, poverty, any notes, if someone were a stranger from a strange land coming to visit us, they would be horrified by how horrible things are. So, the depressing thing is all this awful stuff. Now, a good question might be is, why is human being such a downer? Well, again, his point is to try to establish the problem of evil. And to do that, he's got to lay out all of the evils. And this is, again, an interesting and kind of depressing, question of the fact, are things actually that bad? Now, one way to sort of, perhaps reply to this, which Hume, which is considered a bit here, is it may be sort of disproportionately reported. People often ask, why is there so much bad news? Well, the main reason is that that's what gets on the news. I mean, a leading story of something like, people were nice to each other today. There were birthdays. People had cake. There were, of all the people in the world, there were billions of people who did not kill anybody else, who did not, burn down anything or shoot anybody. There are places where there were no war. And that doesn't really make for big headlines. It's not a big headline, people were nice, there was cake, type of thing. Although cake is worth reading about. Now, he does, raise the following concern. What about those who, who they're just being sort of overly sensitive? That it's not as bad, as it seems. People are just kind of overreacting. Well, here his reply is that if someone has a, delicacy of taste, let's say more sensitive things, it would seem that they should enjoy things more. But again, the gist of it is everything is pretty awful. Now, what about the reply of we kind of create the trouble ourselves? Why not just kind of, don't worry, be happy, like the song said. Just kind of relax. Well, in response to that resting leads to disappointment. And then that leads to ambition and trouble. So sort of the overall claim is that if we're doing stuff, we're going to be miserable. If we're resting, we're going to be miserable as well. So it's all misery. That's what it comes. Now, as another counter to it, the character of Cleanthes tries to say that he sees this problem in other people, but not in himself. And then Demeter replies back, well, then Cleanthes must be really unusual. Okay, so the gist of the first part, for test quiz purposes, etc., is basically, again, everything is awful. That's the claim. So where's he going to go with this? Or is he just trying to depress us? Well, his objective, again, is not just to depress us and make us feel bad about the day, but, again, to get to the problem of evil. And generically, again, the problem of evil is this. How do you reconcile God being good, powerful, and knowing with evil? Now, Philo puts forth the following ground rule to the challenge, which is this. Cleanthes, he challenges to address this problem. How to reconcile evil with God. And to put a limit on it, Philo says that Cleanthes has to stick with what's called anthropomorphism. What does that mean? Well, it literally means this. Anthro means what? Like anthropology. Well, it's about us. Anthro is human. And so, and morph, of course, is, form. Like the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. I guess they're still with them. And so the idea basically, literally, would be man form or human form ism. So what does that mean? Well, basically the idea is this. In this particular context, what Philo is challenging Cleanthes to do is define goodness, wisdom, intelligence, power, etc., in terms of humans. Basically, the terms of things that we mean. To be a little clearer, basically what it means is this. We have to use the terms like justice, goodness, wisdom, power, evil, the way we use them. Now, a good question might be is, what other ways are there, and why raise this point? Well, here's why. One way that some folks way back in the day tried to respond to the problem of evil was this. Some would see this as kind of a cheat. What they tried to do is take terms like, goodness and justice and wisdom, and say that those don't apply to God. God's justice is not like our justice. God's goodness is not like our goodness. It's incomprehensible. So we can't put our categories on God. So the gist of the argument is we can't apply the problem of evil because they're trying to apply our standards to God, and they're totally inapplicable. So we see disease and war and genocide and famine and death and poverty, and we say that's bad, but we're treating God as if God was like a person. Because if we had to use my usual crappy analogy, if we had someone who claimed to be a superhero, they claimed to be like Superman, and they claimed to have like all these superpowers and were trying to help us, but they didn't do a darn thing, we would say, well, they're not so super after all. And what the reply was basically is, well, this means something different when you apply it to God. Our standards don't apply to them. So we kind of like saying the superhero, well, it seems like evil to us, so they're not helping anybody, not doing any good, but you have to judge them by, we can't judge them by our standards because they're totally like super. So one reply was, God is so different from us, we can't apply our own standards. It'd be like ants trying to judge us. So what Hume was trying to do is saying you can't take that up. You just can't say, oh, hell, we don't know, it's beyond us, it's beyond our understanding. He's saying we're going to play by this rule. We got to use our terms as we use them. Good is defined as we use it, justice as we define it, etc. Now it is fair, of course, to say that he's, setting up rules that are unfair, but we'll stick with that. So rule number one basically is this. Cleanthes, the challenge is, Cleanthes is going to show that God is compatible with all this awfulness. The rule is, he can't just go off and say, well, it means something different. He has to play by our normal definitions. So how does this play out? Well, first argument is this, the power argument. So how powerful is God supposed to be? If God got in a fight with the Hulk, who would win? Yeah, God wins every fight. His power is infinite. So whatever God wants, as the classic song says, God gets. So whatever is in accord with his will. But, according to Hume, there is no happiness, which can be seen as kind of extreme, but that's what he claims. So all the misery that occurs, all the earthquakes, genocide, death, thievery, exploitation, suffering, cancer, melanoma, which is a form of cancer, etc., all of that is God's will. So, if his power is infinite, that means he does not will that we are happy, because he could make it so. When you use a crappy analogy, it'd be like having someone who claims to be your friend, who claims the ability to do stuff for you, but they never do anything. All promises, no delivery. And so you might suspect that if they actually do have this ability to, deliver something, and they never do, they don't want to. I mean, to use this kind of stupid example, if someone says, that they're going to get you a cake, and you know they can get a cake, but they never do, you'd probably suspect they don't intend to get you a cake. And so the argument is, if God's power is infinite, whatever God wants, he gets. We're all sad and miserable, so he doesn't want us to be happy. Now, it doesn't conclude that God doesn't exist. He doesn't say, therefore, God doesn't exist. He says, basically, therefore, God does not want us to be happy, if he does exist. Second argument, the wisdom argument. Now, we can be excused for our mistakes because our wisdom is not infinite. We make mistakes. We can disappoint people. We can make bad choices. But does God make bad choices? No. Well, the traditional view. So God's wisdom is infinite. So he's never wrong, never mistaken. But there's a lot of awful stuff. So Hume's inference is that what we're getting, since God's wisdom is infinite, we're not getting stuff through mistakes, we're getting it because this is the way God wants things to be. So either God doesn't exist, so things are just playing out this way, or he really doesn't want us to be, things to be that good. To use another, crappy analogy, going back to like the friend example. Suppose there's a friend who claims to know your favorite cake, but instead they get you the cake that you're horribly allergic to that would kill you if you ate it. You suspect that either they don't know, they really don't know, what kind of cake you like and don't know that this cake would kill you, or they just don't care. So the gist of those two arguments is, if God has got infinite power, what he wants is what he gets. We've got lots of misery and unhappiness, so God must want that. God doesn't make mistakes, so you can't say, with people, when we screw up stuff, we can make mistakes. People screw up all the time. And even if we try our best, we still make mistakes. We get the cake wrong. Like there was a girl who wanted a My Little Pony cake, but apparently the person misheard it as My Little Tony, who apparently was like an obscure singer, kind of like an Elvis-like singer, so she got a My Little Tony cake instead of a My Little Pony cake, which is just like, what's this? Which would be very sad. And so with us, we screw things up. We don't claim to be perfect, and so we can explain our mistakes that way. But if God is perfect, then he wouldn't be making these mistakes. So the conclusion Philo makes is this. What then do we say about God's goodness? Now this is an old problem. There was a philosopher, Roman era, named Epicurus. And we get our current term Epicurean from that today. An Epicurean is someone who likes the finer stuff in life. And Epicurus raised the following questions about this problem of evil. Is God willing to make everything good, but not able? In other words, he's lacking in power. Or is he able to do so? He could do it, but not willing to do so. Or is he able to make stuff happen, and he's actually willing all this stuff? And all those options are basically, in a way, bad for God. That he's willing to do it, but he can't do it. In which case, again, it's like someone who really would like to, give their kids presents, for example, but doesn't have the money. In which case you'd say, well, they're good intentions, but can't make it happen. Or is it the person could do it, they're just bad, or are they able to do it and bringing about badness, in which case they're really bad. And so the gist of this is basically trying to reconcile God's alleged attributes, infinite power, infinite wisdom, infinite goodness, with the problems we got, which is, of course, the classic problem of evil. Before pressing on, anything about that stuff that needs more stuff? Okay, Hume, pretty thorough. Keeps on grinding along. Now, the next thing he brings up is another variation on kind of the natural selection argument. Again, one of the ongoing debates in both philosophy and science goes down to those two opposing bumper stickers, which is everything happens for a reason, and the opposing one is just stuff happens. Basically a non-purposeful universe versus a purposeful universe. Now in the science fields, the general consensus is for the purposeless universe. Big Bang, natural selection, no purpose. Cleanthes, of course, believing in the character believing in God, believes that nature has both a purpose and an intention. Stuff happens for a reason. And the character of Philo, that's to say Hume, gives forth what we now would recognize as kind of a natural selection evolution response. Which is this. All that we get is what is required for preservation and propagation, or in modern terms, basically the survival of the individual until they can reproduce, and essentially just the natural selection system, which, crunched down, grossly oversimplified, the idea is that whatever survives and reproduces, that gets passed on. Now, in support of this, Hume notes that that seems to suffice. That, just as people believe in evolution and don't believe in purpose, the purpose of the universe, we're arguing today. You can explain it all with natural selection. Now, he also adds in more, that if you look at the universe, or at least our little corner of it, that there's nothing that exists purely for our happiness. That there's pain and all of this suffering, and essentially no evidence of divine benevolence. So again, he's basically saying if you look at what we got, that does not seem to point towards a divinely benevolent being that is making everything really, great. And he says only the mystics could claim that this is, a good thing. So just basically, what this reply is, we can explain everything that seems to be a purpose based on what we call today natural selection. We don't need, it's a supernatural account. And then we look at what's available to us. There seems to be no evidence of benevolence. There seems to be just, suffering, pain, etc. Or so he claims. Now, Cleanthes does recognize that if we can show that everyone's unhappy, then that's it for religion. That wraps it up for God. Now, Demea gives the first reply, one we saw before. one reply to the, I guess, the problem of big misery is the big picture reply to the problem of evil, which goes like this. If you look at a particular point and moment in time, things may not look so great. One analogy, or one example that I would use, it's also an analogy, is the thing about the kids getting their shots. I remember when I got mine. It was long ago, but I still remember, and I still don't like shots. And I remember, when I was a kid, I had no idea. It's like, oh, this is awful and painful, I hate this. Same with like brushing my teeth, something like that. But then, of course, once you understand what it's all about, what seems awful, getting the shot, having to brush your teeth, turns out to be a good thing. You get the shot, you don't get polio, so you get to walk, which is good. You brush your teeth, which seems kind of unpleasant, but then you get to keep your teeth. And brushing your teeth is way, way more pleasant than a root canal. So it could be the case, this big picture argument. What seems unpleasant to us is just unpleasant in this point in moment, and then things are better later on. Kind of a final illustration is, everyone's probably heard about people, because they often do books and they do movies about them, who end up in like some terrible disaster. They lose like a leg, or both legs, or an eye, or both eyes, or something horrible happens to them. Then they go on to do like remarkable, incredible things, often including getting like commercials on TV. And so we might say is what seems really awful in the short, immediate term actually turns out to be good. And so it's kind of the big picture reply. If you want to get really big in the big picture, you can bring into account the entire universe, that other regions and other times in the future will be way better. So the stock big picture reply is, well, yeah, things may seem, if you look too close, things may seem kind of bad, but if you take the big picture approach, you'll see how awesome everything is. The second reply, or another reply given, is from Cleanthes, which is this. And he's essentially engaging on sort of the, factual dispute. The argument put forth, about the problem of evil is everything sucks. Then you die. Then it sucks more. But Cleanthes replies back, not the case. It's actually an exaggeration of all the suffering. That there's more health than sickness, more pleasure than pain, more happiness than sadness. And again, this is kind of an empirical, assessment. If you're laying out like all the bads and the goods in the world, which is a value judgment, which weighs more? Are things by and large, better or worse? And you could say true. There are wars, but there's also cake. There are earthquakes, but there are also pleasant, sunny days on beaches. There is, Ebola, but there's also ice cream, that type of stuff. And so you could argue that if you weigh all the stuff, have the ice cream, the cake, the sunny days on the beach, kittens and puppy dogs and all that stuff here, then all the crappy stuff here, and you weigh it, you could argue, well, the good outweighs the bad. Which seems like a, intriguing argument. So how does Philo respond to that? Well, again, we quite a downer. First reply, he engages the objection, on the dispute about the way. And he claims that there's more pain, more torment, more death, more suffering. And so if you were to weigh it out, contrary to what Cleanthes says, the bad outweighs the good. Which of course is, an important question. If you go through life, which is there more bad, more good? Now even notes kind of an interesting but unfortunate point. Something all of us have probably figured out for ourselves, which is this. Pleasures wear out very quickly, and you can prove this yourself. Think of like your favorite dessert. Now, when you eat your favorite dessert and you start eating it, at first what? It's really, really good. What happens if you just keep eating it? Yeah, eventually you kind of like, not so good, not so good. Eventually, like, God, I can't eat any more of this. And one thing, I learned this myself through, there's a pie, cherry grease pie my grandmother would always make for me. And eventually I just eat it all. At first it's like awesome, eating all that all the time. Eventually at that point, man, I can't eat this stuff anymore, because I would think like, can't eat it. It actually took me a few years to get to the point where I could eat it again, because I'd eaten just so much of it. I was just OD'd on the pot. And so, yeah, we know that we can take things that are very enjoyable and wear them out pretty quickly. And dessert's a good example. But what about pain? If you've ever been like badly injured, does the pain just sort of like wear out after a while? Oh no, the pain just keeps on going. Because I had a complete quadriceps tear, which is basically it's the thing that connects the muscles here to your lower part of your leg, so you can do things like walk and stand, which are pretty important, it turns out. And so they had to, cut me open, find the tendons, sew them back in place, which is just as awesome as it sounds. And man, that hurt for a really long time. Yeah, and so pain can just keep on, the sad thing about pain is it just keeps on going and going and going. And so it does seem that, Hume is right. Pleasure wears out pretty quickly, pain just keeps on going. Another example would be, think of like, go with the dessert thing, that wears out quickly, but if you're sitting like, suffering in a class, it just gets worse. It doesn't stop getting bad, it just gets worse. Or if you're stuck in an airport, it just keeps getting worse. So his reply is basically, contrary to Clancy's, the awfulness outweighs the goodness, and also the pain just out-endures and outlasts the pleasure, or so it claims. And the only end is death, which is pretty depressing. So Philo claims that what has to be done, his opponents have to show that human life is happy, existence is desirable, and this will show that religion is a foundation, that we can thus believe in a being that cares about us and is trying to do right by us in the universe. But Philo says, nope. Now his next reply is this. Suppose, even if Philo grants, for the sake of the discussion, suppose he says, okay, even though everything sucks and the suck outweighs the good stuff, blah, 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 let's just suppose hypothetically, contrary to fact, that there's actually more happy than sad. Philo says, even that wouldn't be good enough. Why? Because we'd expect better. And going back to my crappy analogy, with this, someone comes in and says, hey, I'm a perfect student, and they say, follow me, on my Twitter account, @perfectstudent, and like my Facebook page, perfect student, and you see them just constantly getting C's, you'd say, well, you're not a bad student, but you're certainly not a perfect student. I would expect more from a perfect student. And essentially this is what Philo is saying, through, Hume saying through Philo, we'd expect better. If you got a being that's all good, all knowing, and powerful, you'd expect better results. Or to use another crappy analogy, suppose someday you become rich, and you decide, like rich people often do, you need some original art for your mansion. And you go to someone who claims to be a great artist, and you pay them $10 million for a painting. And you get it and you look at it and you say, well, that's okay, but it's not really that great. And so you'd expect more. Someone's supposed to be this great artist, you'd expect more. And so basically it's the expectation argument. What we got is not as good as we'd expect if we had, all good, all knowing, all powerful God. Or so it goes. So he rolls into the finish. No, so he raises, kind of the $64 billion question. Why is there any evil at all? Why is that a thing? Why isn't it a really, great world? Leibniz, of course, tried to, address this problem, but it's still a good question. Why is there any badness at all? Why is it just not an evil-free universe? Well, if we do accept God, it can't be by chance. Because if people who don't believe, people who are atheists, and you ask them, why does stuff suck? And they just say, stuff happens. Why is there, like Ebola? Evolution. Just evolved to kill us. Why are there earthquakes? Just the way the universe works. You get a planet, you've got, a molten core, you get all this motion, you get earthquakes. Why do we die? Well, natural selection, all that stuff. But if we believe that someone's in charge, you can't say it happens by chance. Now, it also can't be contrary to his intention. one that people often bring up, the kind of standard reply to evil, is Hume doesn't consider this, but it's one stock reply is they bring up the devil, and then of course the easy reply is the devil is created by God, and so whatever the devil does is because God created him and lets him do that stuff. Because if God's God, he could take out. He wouldn't even create the devil. But if he decided to do so, he could take the devil out just instantly because he's God and the devil's just one of his creations. And so it would seem that there's no reason why there should be any evil. Now Philo, let's say Hume, does not conclude that God conclusively doesn't exist. What he says is this. He does acknowledge that the world we got is compatible with the possible existence of God. But, he says, we can't infer, logically, a perfect being from what we got. Again, going back to my crappy perfect student thing. If someone keeps saying they're a perfect student and you look, they get their test and put them on their desk and say, look, another perfect C, another perfect C, you would think that either they don't know what that word means or they're really not perfect. But you might say, well, maybe they really are a perfect student, they're just not really trying that hard, or maybe the professor's out to get them, or something. But the mere possibility that you could have like a perfect being in kind of a crappy universe, he thinks is insufficient. That first, we have no reason to infer a perfect being from what we got. Just like if you see a student, constantly getting C's, you wouldn't say, wow, I bet they're really an A student, on the inside. And so his ultimate conclusion is this. He doesn't conclude that God doesn't exist. He says we can't infer a perfect being from the evidence we've got. Is it compatible? Is it possible? Yes, but we're unjustified in our inference. And he says, perhaps sarcastically, perhaps seriously, that faith alone can allow us to have that belief, which can be taken two ways, at least. One is, Hume is being critical. He's saying, there's no basis for this in reason. The only way a person can believe this is they would just believe based without any evidence. The other approach is, or interpretation, is that Hume is saying that while reason cannot, support this, a person can accept it by faith. One that makes Hume slightly difficult to sort of put into a category is there's a passage in one of his works which can be interpreted, either of those ways. One is he's saying, essentially faith is okay, and the other is basically saying the only way you can believe this is by faith, and of course that's kind of absurd. And unfortunately we don't have a recording of his voice, so we don't know whether he's saying with like a sarcastic tone or with a serious tone. So quick recap for like test quiz stuff. What's going on here? Well, sort of part one is, here's all the evils. Here's why life is awful. What's the problem of evil? The problem of evil is reconciling all of that awfulness with God supposedly being all good, all powerful, all knowing. If he's all powerful, he should get what he wants. Like the song, what God wants, he gets. We haven't got like all this happiness, so either God doesn't want it, or he doesn't exist, or he's not all powerful. Then with the wisdom thing, if God is perfectly, all-knowing, he knows how to make everything happy. Since we're not happy, either God doesn't have perfect wisdom, or he doesn't exist, or he doesn't want us to be happy. And of course, all of that's bad. Then we go to, additional criticisms from our good friend, well, I guess it's a fake person, Philo, and they end up with the ultimate conclusion is basically this. Namely that we cannot infer the existence of a perfect being for an imperfect world, but it is compatible, and it would be possible to accept this on faith alone, either said in a sarcastic tone, like that would be ridiculous, or said with a serious tone. Yes, this is an option, which is why Hume is classified as a skeptic. Before heading to immortality, anything about evil that needs more stuff? Now, one philosophical question that we all get an answer to is this: what happens when we die? hopefully we don't get an answer for, that's one of those questions that people don't want to get answered for a long time, at least through their own experience. Not surprisingly, people have been concerned about what happens after we die since there have been people who wonder what goes on. Now, one of the kind of stock assumptions in the time Hume was humifying was dualism, what's called substance dualism. We saw this before, but a quick recap is this. If you're a substance dualist, you believe there's two types of stuff in the universe. There's material stuff, which is supposed to be the stuff like this, like the body. And then there's supposed to be, there's also supposed to be immaterial stuff. Basically we've got the physical world and the non-physical. And so a commonly held view, people like Descartes, Locke, etc., was that you got two types of substance, two types of stuff. Physical stuff, and we know what happens to physical stuff. When the body dies, that's it. But it's supposed to be a non-material substance, the soul, spirit, or mind. And when people talk about survival after death, they talk about not the body going on, because we know the body just, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, that's gone. Our chances of survival lie with the non-physical, at least, in the past. Interestingly, boringly enough, and we'll talk about this, more in later sections, what's being proposed today, and it's been a thing in science fiction for quite some time, is immortality in the flesh. The idea being that as parts fail, they'll be able to replace them. And we can already do a fair amount of replacing. We can replace some stuff with, organic parts. Everyone's probably heard of like heart transplants, liver transplants, eye transplants, face transplants. For real, they transplant faces. Also, fingers, arms, etc. And so you can kind of do like some kind of Frankenstein-like thing where as your parts wear out, you get replacement parts. And eventually, of course, your brain might wear out, and so the question would be if they replace your brain, that's still you. And of course, they're also working on things, mechanical replacements. Everyone's probably heard of Oscar Pistorius, the infamous Blade Runner, now currently known for being found guilty of, I believe, killing his girlfriend. But didn't have the lower parts of his legs. He's got those artificial legs and ran. And so they're mechanical parts as well. And everyone's probably heard of well, you might have heard, actually this is way before most people's time, but the Bionic Man. It gets like the bionic eye and arm, etc. And so I'm going to replace our pieces with mechanical parts. We can be better, faster, stronger. It used to be a $6 million man. Today it'd be more like $6 billion. And I think about bringing that back because Hollywood has no ideas. So we're going to see the $6 billion man as a movie. Now, but back then, of course, the assumption was your body goes, that's it for you. So the bet was placed on the soul. Now, Hume says it's really difficult to prove this immortality. And he's going to look at it with three sets of arguments: the metaphysical, the moral, and the physical. And what he's going to do basically is what we've seen before, the argument by elimination, where you say, in this case, there's only three possible ways to argue for immortality. These all failed, so we have no reason to believe in immortality. Now, Hume, again, he doesn't come to a decisive conclusion. He doesn't say, yeah, when you die, that's it. He says, given the arguments, we have no reason to think that immortality is possible. Now, when Hume was dying, as someone came to talk to him, Hume's laying there suffering from whatever was killing him, and the person asked him, do you believe in an afterlife? Because people, fairly often have deathbed conversions. And Hume pointed to the fire and said, well, it would be possible, I suppose, to put a piece of coal on the fire and not have it burn, but it seems incredibly unlikely. So Hume's view is not, there's definitively no afterlife. His view is that we just can't, prove it, but it's probably not. So I'll begin with the metaphysical arguments. Now, the first thing it brings up is kind of a stock problem, which is this. There's supposed to be two types of substance. Ghosty stuff, as I like to call it, and to use like early 20th century name ectoplasm, ghosty stuff. And then there's supposed to be material stuff, matter. We're very familiar with, assuming this is material, we're very familiar with matter, because it's like all the stuff, that we're touching and sitting on, and what our bodies are made of. So you get ghosty stuff and physical stuff. Now, as Hume notes, our notion of substance is very confused and imperfect. How so? Well, again, I use my usual crappy illustration. We take the folder, and supposedly, if we were to take away, the redness, the rectangularness, the plasticness, and all of the qualities, we'd be left with matter, whatever that is. And of course, when you think about it, if you take away all that stuff, what are you left with? Well, people may be inclined to say nothing. What would be something that has no qualities? And the easy answer would be, well, nothing. Kind of like a riddle. What is something that has no qualities? Nothing. And the same for the immaterial. It's supposed to be if you took away all the thoughts, feelings, emotions, desires, memories, and all that stuff, it'd be the, whatever's left over. And again, you might say, well, if you take away all that stuff, you're left with nothing. So Hume says, in regards to that, sort of the gist of the problem is this, that this notion of substance by itself is just totally confused and ridiculous, and we really have no way of supporting that exists. But he says, so sort of his first argument is, this is like a big, weird mystery. But then he says, okay, laying the weird mystery stuff aside, let's see where it goes. So he argues this. Now, we believe that the way matter works is, well, to use what Hume said, that matter is sort of like, clay, that it can just be reshaped. In fact, we, in physics, we have the idea that, basically the matter cannot be created or destroyed, it merely changes shape. So, for example, we use the example of like lunch. If you have like a sandwich, you take the sandwich, which was once, depending on what you're eating, like if you have like a chicken sandwich, it was once like chicken and maybe some lettuce and plants and stuff, and we convert that into us. And then of course eventually we stop being, and us gets converted eaten by something else. If someone gets eaten by a shark, they become shark. And the shark gets eaten by like a bigger shark, that becomes like more shark. And so we know that the matter is constantly changing. But of course, according to the sciencey stuff, does matter ever get destroyed? No, been around forever, be around forever. To use, Hume's not aware of this, but to use one example, all the iron in your body, that's in your blood, was once part of a supernova, because iron, as far as we know, is created only in supernovas. So at one point, part of you is part of a star exploding, which in a way is kind of cool, but also kind of creepy in a way. And so it's big recycling stuff. Now, Hume reasons like this. Well, let's take the analogy. He says, well, if you got substance, non-physical and physical, the physical stuff just keeps getting recycled. Person has, has shark fin soup. Shark fin becomes part of person. Ironically, later in that day, the person gets eaten by a shark. Then they become part of the shark. Then the shark gets caught by, by people fishing, and then someone else eats it. And then the shark becomes them. And then they get eaten by a shark, and they become shark. And it keeps on going and going. So the matter just keeps constantly getting recycled. But of course, if a person is eaten by a shark, even though the stuff making up their body, the molecules keep on going, do they keep on going? No. Or you take another example. If you take like wood and burn it for a fire, the matter energy that makes it up keeps on going, but the thing is gone. Now, by analogy, according to Hume, the material stuff would work in the same way. So just like, he argues, just as your body, the stuff that makes it up can keep getting recycled, but, if a person gets eaten by a shark, their body's gone. If it's made into shark, sure, the matter keeps on going, but the person is gone. And likewise with if this immaterial, ghosty stuff, it just keeps getting, recycled and changed. So the stuff could be immortal, eternal, just like the matter is eternal and immortal, but the person is gone. So by analogy, if, say, the person's body, when they die, breaks down, gets eaten by something, the body, they're gone. Sure, the molecules, the matter makes it up, keeps them going, but they're gone. Likewise, when the person dies, the immaterial substance, if there is such a thing, may keep on going, but the person is gone, or so it claims. Now, to put a modern addition to it, the folks who do quantum physics, like Stephen Hawkins and other famous smart folks, they claim, interestingly enough, that information can never be destroyed. Now, it may be inaccessible to us. For example, if you ever were doing like a paper on your computer and your hard drive goes, you may not be able to recover that paper, but according to the folks in quantum physics, information is never destroyed, ever. The only problem is, of course, we can't always get to it. And so, interestingly, Hume, of course, is unaware of this. Even when you die, all the information is still preserved somehow, and could be, in theory at least, recovered. But then, of course, the question would be, would it still be you? Say 10,000 years hence, technology advances to the point where they can go and get the urn, or coffin you're in, and then reconstruct, that, recover all the information, rebuild a body that looks just like yours now, recover all your memories, and so you wake up wait a minute, what's going on? And of course the question would be, would that still be you? Or just something very much like you? And Hume's kind of addressing that question. Maybe the stuff that makes it up keeps on going, but the question would be, would you still be going? And Hume thinks, no, you would not be going. Now, to sort of illustrate this, he uses kind of an interesting example, or situation. Now, everyone's probably heard about, the past life thing, the idea of reincarnation, that people have existed before. Now, Hume notes this. He argues, which could be incorrect, whatever cannot be destroyed, let's say whatever is incorruptible, is also ingenerable, which means he's claiming whatever cannot be destroyed also cannot be, essentially created. So it has to exist forever. Now, interestingly, boringly enough, that's the notion we get about energy and matter. It cannot be created nor destroyed, it just changes form. Now, this would mean that if that were, assuming this is all correct, that if the soul had this immortality, it would exist before birth. In other words, you would always exist and you could never go out of existence. But, do you remember that? Do you remember what you were doing before you were reborn? Most people don't. I mean, in a way, it could be handy, because if you went to school before, you just keep your degree, all your degrees. You wouldn't have to go back and say, I went to Harvard, back in 1834, and was at Plato's Academy back then. Yeah, but unfortunately, I guess that doesn't transfer across lives. So basically, his argument is, we don't have any recollection of what existed before then, and so we can expect we're not going to exist after we die, or so he claims. Now, he does kind of an aside here, which is this, because he brings up the point about animals. Now, the reason why he brings that up is essentially as a criticism of the people he's kind of aiming at. And we'll see this when we talk about, when he talks about women later on. The people he's arguing against claim that animals don't have souls. And his reasoning is that we have as much reason to think animals have souls as we do. But the people he's arguing against, aiming explicitly at, claim animals don't. So if you're wondering why I throws in the animal soul thing, because of that. So in regards to the physical or the metaphysical arguments, his arguments are basically this. One, substance is just weird, just really weird. Argument two, even if you believe in that really super weird immaterial substance, this doesn't give you personal immortality, because we accept that matter, exists forever. We can accept immaterial substance existing forever, but it just keeps changing form. And just like having the molecules that make you up keep on going, doesn't mean you keep on going. Having the ghosty stuff keep on going doesn't mean you keep on going. What you need is you keeping on going. And he says that if we accept that the soul is indestructible, it has to be around forever, and so presumably you would be aware of your existence before birth, but you're not. And so we can expect that after death you'll be just as aware as you are of your previous existence, which is to say, not at all. Now before going into the moral arguments, anything about the metaphysical that needs any more meta stuff? Now he turns to the following moral argument. One argument for immortality, interestingly enough, boringly enough, is that there has to be immortality because there has to be reward and punishment in the afterlife. And other philosophers have made this argument explicitly, that we look at the world and we see that the wicked often triumph and the good often die young. And so in order to balance the books, balance the scales, people contend there has to be immortality, because God's justice of punishing the wicked and rewarding the good has to be taken care of. So we have to exist after death. Now, Hume says, doesn't seem to be a reason to believe in that. Because if we look at the universe that we've got, there seems to be no basis for that inference. And he claims, well, the next thing he sort of argues is this, is that this doesn't really disprove the claim, but he says what people are doing, certain people are doing, is fostering fears about the afterlife to have an advantage here. Basically scaring people, crudely put, scaring people about hell in order to basically control people or get money from them. Now again, that doesn't disprove the existence of immortality, but he's essentially trying to show that there are people who have a motivation that is, not based on a supporting claim, but based on imposing fear in order to get, riches. But what's his main reply to this point? Because he kind of goes off focus a bit. So what's his off focus and then his on focus? Well, again, he throws in the side point about animals. And his reasoning here, again, is the people who he's targeting, arguing against, take the view that animals don't have souls. But he claims, by parity of reasoning, which you saw before in our good dead friend Ganilo, that if humans have immortality, so should animals. If we don't believe animals have immortality, we shouldn't believe that humans do. Then he brings the point about women. A good question might be like, why? Isn't this off subject? And the answer is yeah, because what he's trying to do here is this. The people he's arguing against take the view that, kind of traditional religious view, that women are vastly inferior to men. Kind of standard view in most religions. Now, and what he's doing is kind of an irony argument here. What he's saying is this. If we assume that there's not immortality, then the inferiority of women makes sense. Why? Well, because all they have to do is do all the domestic tasks here, and they can be, inferior to men. But, he says, if we assume immortality, then men and women should be perfectly equal. Roughly put, will there be mopping in heaven? Presumably not. Will there be domestic chores in heaven? Will there be toilets to be cleaned? No. And so, Hume's point here is not presumably to claim that women are inferior. It's not attacking women. His point, again, is kind of in a way an ironical. The people who he's targeting take the view that women are vastly inferior to men. But his claim is that if you believe in immortality, let's say believe in the sort of standard religious argument, it should be accepted that men and women are equal, because they're going to spend infinity in the afterlife, and they're going to have equal tasks, equal chores, and all the things that are supposed to be women's work, you know, cooking, cleaning, making sandwiches, there's not going to be any of that in the afterlife. So the inferiority of women makes no sense on the idea of immortality. Again, his point is not to take shots at women. His point is, if someone really believes in immortality, then they should believe in the equality of men and women. So that's his, nothing really to do with, you know, the main argument. Kind of goes off track a bit, but that's his point. So then he gets back on track. So how does he try to show that you can't infer immortality from this claim about God's justice? Well, the first argument is this. If we accept that God is the first cause, as Leibniz and others argue, and everything is ordained by God, then there is nothing for God to punish, because everything that occurs, God makes occur. To illustrate this, I'll use my standard crappy analogy. Suppose you've got a G.I. Joe doll, a Ken doll, and a Barbie doll. And you take the Barbie doll and the G.I. Joe doll, and you have them have an affair, because Barbie's married to Ken. And then you say, oh, evil Barbie, evil G.I. Joe doll, you're so evil. And you fire the barbecue, you know, get a good fire going and say, you're going to hell for your evil. Would that make any sense? No, because Ken and Barbie can't do otherwise. I mean, Ken and G.I. Joe can't do otherwise. You know, making it all happen. The person would be crazy. You'd be like, what the hell are you doing burning stuff? You know, like I must punish G.I. Joe for a sin. It's like, whoa, easy there. You know, it's just a toy. It's a doll. It doesn't have affairs and do stuff. Now, if we truly take seriously that God causes everything and makes everything happen, that's all in accord with God's will, then punishing us would be just as sensible as punishing G.I. Joe and Barbie. We're just puppets. It would be nonsensical. We can't do otherwise. We have to do what God wills. Now, of course, the usual reply to this, of course, is free will, that we get to choose, which raises a whole other can of worms. Namely, how do we reconcile the idea that God, you know, is in charge to make everything happen, and yet we are totally free to do whatever? And that creates all kinds of problems. Second, it seems to be a punishment without any purpose behind it. It doesn't seem to achieve any objective, or so Hume claims. Third argument, proportionality. One thing we generally try to accept in human justice, if we have a concept of justice, is the idea that the punishment should be proportional to the crime. That we should not over-punish people. Which seems reasonable, because if we punish people way more than they deserve, we're just creating more evil. And so one of the moral challenges in a society that tries to be just is try to figure out if a crime is this bad, then we try to match the punishment to fit that, and not have it be more, because then we'd just be doing awful stuff. And not have it be like way less, because then we wouldn't be, you know, being just. Now, as Hume points out, basically in sort of classic religion, you get one punishment, namely infinite hell, infinitely forever, infinitely bad. And Hume's argument is that is disproportional. There is no sin a person could commit that could warrant infinite punishment. Which is, you know, a problem that religious thinkers are aware of. How do you justify infinite punishment for a finite crime? Because no matter how bad a person is, even if you take someone like Hitler, Hitler could not have done infinite evil, because he was only around for so much time, and even though his evil, you could say, was vast, it wasn't infinitely vast. And so if we punish someone infinitely, we're punishing way out of proportion. Now, Hume doesn't note this, but other thinkers have tried to address this problem. There's a famous thinker from New England, Jonathan Edwards. Not the Jonathan Edwards who ran for president, you know, had an affair, you know, that horrible mess, but different guy, back in the 1600s. He wrote a classic sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which I had to read, I remember it stuck in my mind, and I read it in elementary school, required reading. And here's the idea. Here's how he argues. He claims that since God is infinitely good, any sin against God is infinitely bad. So even the smallest of sins, no matter how small, it could be like not paying your fine on a library book, for example, or all the way up to like genocide. All sins are infinitely bad. There's no division. So any wrongdoing is infinitely bad. And so the punishment, since every crime is infinitely bad, has to be infinite. But he points out that the punishment is no more than infinite. And so one way to argue that it is just is that argument. Infinitely good God, any sin against God is infinitely bad, therefore the infinite punishment is justified. Of course, then he ran into the problem of, but then wouldn't everybody end up in hell? And his solution, you know, and of course that wouldn't be very successful religion. If you just told people, yeah, no matter what you do, you're going to hell. People were like, okay, I'll just do whatever, because it doesn't matter. And so what they claimed was that you were predestined, heaven or hell. But nothing you could do can make a difference, but some people God chose arbitrarily, perhaps randomly, for heaven. And some people ended up in hell, which seems like, even like having a legal system based on a lottery. You just do whatever, and you know, you just get a card in the mail. Congratulations. You know, here's $1 million, or congratulations, the death squad is right behind you. Ooh, crap. Type of deal. Now, he does throw out some additional concerns. One is, this bipolar thing, heaven and hell, seems to, of course, rest in the assumption that people are pure good or pure evil. But of course, when you deal with people, we notice that people are kind of a blend. Also, he claims, perhaps incorrectly, that we have, not everyone, but most people, have a belief in leniency and punishment. That we want not just, you know, pure justice, but also mercy. And he also brings up a fairly classic problem, which is this. What about people who die in infancy? And in Hume's time, infant mortality was really high, so that happened to a lot of people. And the question would be, since they haven't a chance to do anything, what happens to them? Now, and of course, people who think about, you know, these issues did try to come up with something. For example, if you're familiar with Catholicism, they hit on the idea of a place called limbo, which is where if the person, like, you know, was an infant and, you know, died before baptized, etc., they go to a place that's not as bad as hell, but not as good as heaven. It's kind of a middle ground. You know, it gets used a lot in fiction and, you know, TV and movies. But the basic idea is it's kind of between heaven and hell. You just kind of hang out there. But it does create a bit of a problem. You know, if people aren't pure good or pure evil, where do people go? Now, some people do take a more, I guess, sophisticated, I don't want to say sophisticated, more complicated view. That you could have, like, you know, levels of heaven, levels of hell, different rewards and punishment. Some people take the view that people can be redeemed from hell. So there's all kinds of tweaks on the system. But kind of the standard one is, you know, pretty bipolar. Heaven, hell, infinite, stuck there forever. Okay, before beginning the end for Hume, any stuff on the stuff so far? Needs more Hume stuff. Okay. His last thing, which we won't be able to finish today, are the physical arguments. And he claims that these arguments are also pretty decisive. So to quickly recap the justice one, the argument for there being immortality is there's got to be immortality because we have to be rewarded or punished in the afterlife. His main reply back is, you know, the main flaw is this would seem to be, you know, there's no evidence for this. Secondly, it seems to be unjust because it's just proportional. And so basically his view is that doesn't work. So the physical ones we'll see next time is his arguments in regards to physical arguments, looking at sleep, proportion, condition, and so forth. So next we meet on tomorrow, we'll go on to more Hume stuff. So ends another adventure in philosophy.